I think we're on. Yeah, we're live. Good afternoon or good evening, everybody from well, we're from in cold and slightly not too sunny Carlingford and County Louth in Ireland, and I'm with Bob Kidd in Adelaide in Australia. So how's things, Bob? You tell me it's a bit cold there.
It's a bit cool, mate. It's a bit cool. It's the middle of winter here, and it's cold. It's also 6 in the morning, so I've dragged myself out of my pit, and we're here to do whatever we need to do.
You told me you were the early bird.
I am the early bird. Yeah. 6 o'clock in a winter's morning. Come on, be reasonable.
Yeah, well, it's half 9 here on a Friday evening. You know, I've been good. I've only got ginger beer this evening.
Well, I'm on lemonade, mate. I'm on Aldi's lemonade, so there we go. That's what I drink at this time of day. I'm disgusting, really, but there we are.
So, how's retirement treating you? You're not really retired, though, Bob, are you?
Retirement is a funny word to me. I retired 10 years ago when I was 55. I'm sorry about this being a bit blunt, but all my friends were dying. I thought, sod that for a bunch of fairies. I better get on with this while I can. But I don't think retirement's about stopping work. Retirement's about doing what you want, not what someone else wants. And so I carry on work, but I work on my terms, where I want and when I want. And that's what I do now.
Very good. And yeah, yourself and Ross are just back from a trip up the Barossa Valley for a couple of months over there.
Well, we live in the Barossa Valley, which my next door neighbour is Wolf Blass. If you're familiar with Wolf Blass wines, he's just over there, about 100 metres. And his grapes are against my garden wall. But we just come back from the Eyre Peninsula. If you go from here about 300 k's north to Port Augusta, which is about halfway across Australia, and then down the Eyre Peninsula to Port Lincoln, to Coffin Bay, which is big oyster country, and then up to Ceduna, and we did about 2,000 k's, which is quite frankly nothing in Australian terms. 2,000 k's, that's just getting your engine warm, really. But we had 3 weeks away.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we've got great oysters here in Carlingford in Ireland. They're very good.
Well, you know,
all over Europe.
5 years ago we were in Ireland. I went across to your school in Galway, did a guest lecture from there. We had a wonderful time. I loved Ireland. Mum's from Belfast, you know, so I've got a bit of Irish in me. And
I've been originally, of course, from Scotland.
Yeah, but Mum's an Ulster Scot from Belfast, and Dad's from Glasgow. Yeah, as you can tell from my broad Scottish accent. But Dad left when I was a baby. Otherwise, I'd sound like Billy Connolly. But they worked in south of Manchester all that's where I was born and bred.
And then that's where you ended up, how you ended up in podiatry school in Salford.
Well, I went to podiatry school in Salford, yes, and I was there as a member, as a student until 1975, and then I had 5 years in the field. Not being very good, quite frankly. I'm not a very good clinician. I'd be the first to admit it. And I went back to teach there in 1980, and things had changed. Boy, had they changed in that 5 years I was away. And that was the big transition in podiatry, just in the late 70s. When I got back there, the winds of change, to quote your Macmillan from Britain, had been through. And they were talking degrees, not diplomas. And things had to change. You either, well, the staff there did one of three things. They either buried their heads in the sand, they retired, or they evolved. And we evolved, and we came out a different animal. You know, that's when we had to go and get a degree and learn about being academic, realizing it wasn't about rote learning, it's about understanding. You know, that's when we had to do a lot of changing, and we did. Boy, did we change in the 80s. And yeah, I remember it well.
And then, yes, because I began in London Foot Hospital in 1989. So yeah, the winds of change had certainly come then. But of course, then your journey on then after podiatry, we'll get back to the way the courses are structured, and I think we're going to touch on a little bit of biomechanics in relation to anatomy soon. But then you headed for sunnier climes then in Australia.
Well, I left the UK in 1990. I did 7 years at Salford. Then went down to Northampton for 3 years. Northampton, probably every school has its day. But in the 80s, Northampton was a very, very futuristic school where all of a sudden people were thinking about what they were doing. They weren't, I mean, to put it this way, when I was at Salford, in the first year, you learnt to use a scalpel. In the second year, you learned to use it quickly. And in the third year, you learned about why you were using it. Well, that doesn't make very good educational sense. When I went to Northampton, all of a sudden in the first year, primary patient assessment. In the second year, you learned about how to do things properly. In the third year, you learned your practical skills. And it was a completely it was turned on its head. And it was an incredibly important place to be at the time. And Linda Merriman was the head of school. Steve Abel was head of clinical teaching. And I learned to be a much better teacher there. I was only there for 3 years, but I learned to be a much better teacher. And I'll never forget my time in Northampton. It was a very, very important time. And then I went out to West Australia.
Well, they're obviously running the courses like I say it should be run, because the way I was taught at LFH, it seemed to be taught backwards. Should have done all the biomechanics and preparation in the first of all, and then do patient treatment at the end, because you didn't understand the theories that you were learning to put into practice.
Northampton had an incredibly important role at the time. Now, maybe it's had its time now. I don't know. My spies in the field tell me that Northampton is now just an ordinary school, just like any other school. But in the 80s, it was incredibly important. The days when Ivan was there, Ivan Bristow and all that crowd, they were the kids I taught, and I learned a lot there. I'll never regret going to Northampton.
Yeah, there's certainly been certain groups of podiatrists, both in research based and then in teaching based, who certainly at certain stages push the profession on at different levels.
I'd agree.
With good clinical groups.
Yeah.
Yes, because I lived the glory days of after I qualified in podiatric biomechanics and all the biomechanics summer schools through the 90s, and Howard Dannenberg and all the tissue stress theories and how those all developed through. So what got you interested in Talus and anatomy, Bob?
Well, I was always interested in anatomy. I should have very, very, very briefly, like 10 seconds. My dad was a GP, but in the UK, a country GP is never just a GP, and Dad did orthopedics. He did hip replacements and this sort of thing, because I'm from Buxton in the Peak District, which is where this stuff all started. And so I was sort of had anatomy in the background as a child growing up. And when I got to West Australia, I was on the staff at Curtin University for their School of Podiatry. I immediately applied. This is 1990. I immediately applied to the University of Western Australia to do anatomy there and to do a PhD. And they said, it sounds like a job for Charles Oxnard, but he's in the States just now. And I went home and looked through my off-print collection and found work from Charles Oxnard on the morphometrics of the Talus. There we are, a Talus, Exhibit A. And I thought, it was all from the University of Chicago. I thought, I can probably deal with an American. I'm not very American, really, but I can deal with that. And he rang me a few days later. He said, I can't believe someone wants to do feet. Please, can you come and do coffee? And he was from Durham in the UK, and he did medicine in Birmingham. He was one of Solly Zuckerman's from Birmingham. And he tells me that in 1957, Solly Zuckerman said to all his staff, there's something funny about the Talus guys, go and find out. And that was 1957. And he then went to Chicago, and then from there to Southern California, then there to West Australia, which is where I met him in 1990. And I got involved in looking at patterns of morphological variation, if that's the right way of putting it, in the hindfoot, not just the Talus, but also the navicular, the calcaneus, and the cuboid, and then later the medial cuneiform. And it's a scary piece of work. The Talus is a very interesting bone, very interesting bone. And
the center of the universe. The astragalus.
But yeah, the astragalus, it drapes over everything. But it's one of only 2 bones in the body with no muscle attachment. There's only 2 bones in the body with no muscle attachment. Now, your starter for 10, you see, Justin, is what's the other bone in the body with no muscle attachment? I bet you don't know.
I only read your research papers.
It's actually the incus in the middle ear is the only other bone in the body with no muscle attachment.
Yeah. So lots of ligament attachments around the surrounding structures, but nothing back to the talus itself.
There's lots of ligamental stuff, but there's no muscle attachment to the talus. No, it's a fascinating bone, and it's kept me occupied now for 32 years. I've been infatuated with it. It's been a fascinating bone. Yeah.
And well, of course, why is the talus called a talus as well? That's always a different one.
Well, when I'm talking to students, I always say this. There's two things. I'll come to the other one in a minute. You need to get involved in anatomy. One of them I'll talk about later if it comes up. The other is get inside the words. What do the words mean? Get in the etymology. And talus actually means a dice. It means actually a gambling dice, as in you roll a 6, you roll a 5 or whatever. Because when you drop a talus on the floor, you roll it like that. It lands different ways up. So you could put numbers on it. You could put 1, 2, 3, 4 on it, and you use it to gamble with. And that's where the name. Yeah, that's where the name comes.
To toss or to throw.
Yeah, but just if you just suppose you're in a casino. God forbid I ever go to a casino, but there you are. You're playing some roulette game, and you roll a dice. You can roll a talus, and that's where its name comes from. But I love the words, because that helps you remember. Because when you're old and stupid like me, you need little hooks to remember things by, and that's how I remember the talus. Yeah, it's a gambling dice. Yeah.
But the thing about anatomy is, as you said, you just don't need to learn it. You need to actually think about it 4-dimensionally. I mean, the way that it actually works.
I hadn't realised. I'd forgotten, because I'm old. I'd forgotten we'd had that conversation, mate. But you need to get really understand it. And I say to the students, you need to think in 4 dimensions, and they go, okay. I said, yeah, 4 dimensions: length, breadth, height. And I say, what's the 4th dimension? And I say to them, remember that film Back to the Future? What did he say? What did that prof say? You're not thinking 4th dimensionally. You're not thinking in time. And our time is either embryological time or evolutionary time. Depends on the question you're asking. In fact, they tell you the same thing. Excuse me. But you need to think in 4 dimensions. And to do that, I mean, I'll give you a very simple example, very briefly. I mean, you get to the anatomical position. Why does your elbow flex forward, but your knee flex backwards? Why does your foot flex backwards, but your wrist flex forward? What? And then if you think in 4 dimensions, go back to the embryology, go back to any mammal, not just humans, any mammal at about 6 weeks old, you'll find this is now a foot, not a hand, right? You'll find the sole is pointing forwards. Come back in 2 weeks, 8 weeks old, like 8 weeks in embryology, and the whole lower limb turned around. Now, until you understand that, you don't make any sense about why it is that your knee flexes backwards, but your elbow flexes forwards. Now, that's just a perfect example of why we have to understand, not learn. Because learning is just paraphrasing. That does you nothing. All these stupid rhymes people have for remembering the cranial nerves or whatever the hell it might be, you know. It just makes no sense.
Yeah, all your popliteal fossa and different things like that. Well, you know, essential for the exam, not very practical later on.
Well, go on.
But and of course the embryological position, interuterine position, and left foot outside and pushing against the wall, and more sort of turning, and more, is that more sort of talipes in those sort of areas as well?
I don't know. I've often wondered about that, because one of the things I got involved in for a long time ago was squatting facets on the talus. Can you see? I'm just trying to get this.
Yeah.
The squatting facet there. What causes those? Because we did a lot of work on that, and it might or might not be embryological, in the fact that when your fetus becomes, if you like, a space-occupying lesion and starts to touch the walls of the uterus, your feet actually squat. And it might, yes, so I got involved in that a little bit, but that's a long time ago.
And of course, I mean, well, my first exposure then would have been learning root mechanics and learning about all this. You know, rear foot was caused by not fully derotation of the embryological sort of bone. And
well, I've done a lot of stuff on root over the years, and in some ways, you know, it made my career. I started off in 1984. I published my first thing called The Pathomechanics of 4-Foot Supinatus. It was a pathetic paper. I look at that and I'm ashamed of it. In the British Journal. But by about the late 80s, I had got a lot of serious misgivings about root. And by about 1991, I'd started publishing some decidedly non-root stuff. And by then, I'd got a scientific brain myself. You know, I was well on the way to being a proper scientist. And I always say I started off by swallowing the whole root theory, hook, line, and sinker. But by about 1981, I was publishing stuff about why it had serious flaws in it.
It was mainly because Root based his theory around there being a neutral somewhere, and that you didn't see that within the morphology we're looking at.
No, I mean the whole concept of neutral is tautological. That is, it uses itself to define itself. I mean, just look at the basic definition of neutral. I mean, neutral is that position where you're neither pronated nor supernated. But what are pronation and supination? They're movements away from neutral. You know, so the whole thing is a scientific nonsense, an absolute scientific nonsense. But I mean, that was heresy. When I said that, I mean, the world tried to have me put down. You know, the head of the Podiatry Association in Western Australia tried to have me removed from my job. You know, we took it seriously. Yeah. Oh God, yeah, that was unbelievably. You can't say that. That's like saying there's no God.
Yours was based on purely research and measurement, and actually, rather than it wasn't a theory, as Root was.
All my work's been based on research and measurement. I spent weeks and weeks in museums all over the world. In 1991, the first thing I had was a round the world ticket. I had 3 of those in all, and I went to Hong Kong and measured Southern Chinese, Talus, navicular, calcanean, cuboid, Southern Chinese. Odd thing that my son-in-law's Chinese, so came back to haunt me, and then I went on from there to the UK, measured Victorian British and Roman British at the British Museum. Then from there, I went on to Washington, DC and measured orangutans. Oh, and also I went in the UK, I went to the museum in Kent, the Powell Cotton Museum in Bircham, and measured chimpanzees and gorillas. And in 1992, I went to South Africa and measured Zulus. And that was my basic collection.
Because all the research was compared against with the human type foot with the orangutan and the chimp and gorilla, and how it had changed.
Basically, I had 3 studies I was interested in. One, I looked at morphological variation inside humans, because there is differences in different human subgroups. Let's keep away from the R word. Let's leave race alone. Not going there. Yeah. There is differences, but they're very subtle. But they are there in humans, and I got interested in those. Then, having done that, I looked at differences between humans as a group compared to gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans. Yeah. And so I was now, if you like, qualified to know what there is. I'm now in a position to say what there was. So I then went back in the fossil record and it's very, very thin, you know, the fossil record. There's not much there. And I went back to East Africa to look at the Olduvai foot from 1.8 million years ago, from Homo habilis. I give you Exhibit A. There's the foot of Homo habilis. There's only one of them. That's a composite put together. Not a very good composite.
1.8 million years old?
1.8 million years ago. Yeah.
And is that how much of the foot bones are there?
Well, there's only one of them. And there we have this left foot from the Olduvai Gorge. And there is, well, forget the individual bones, there's the talus. It's tiny. Look, complete with teeth marks. It's been eaten by something. There's its navicular.
Okay.
And I've got the cuboid, which is a fascinating bone. It's got a great big beak on it. It's got a huge process calcaneus. And that's all we've got of the calcaneus. It's got the facets for the talus and the cuboid. The actual body of the calcaneus is missing. So that's all we've got of that. And so that's what I studied in 1993, 1994, somewhere around there. And that was chapter 4 or whatever the hell it was in my PhD all those years ago, a long, long time ago now. But since then, I've studied the foot from South Africa, little foot, which is only the medial column. It's a talus, navicular, and medial cuneiform.
Yep.
And then back in 2010, I studied Australopithecus sediba from my colleague and my friend Lee Berger found that, and that's about just a little less than 2 million years. That's his talus. That's his calcaneus. Very primitive calcaneus. Very primitive indeed. It's like if you were to put in that's an orangutan. Put the two next to each other. They're very, very, very similar.
Yeah. Okay.
They're very similar. So the point about it was that Australopithecus sediba was really a tree-living ape that came down to the ground once in a while.
So just where did we come from? Fish up onto the ground and then out onto the land via the trees, then, or which way did we go?
Well, my view, well, first of all, there's no doubt that we came out of the water not as a fish but as an amphibian of some sort. And don't forget, we weren't human in those days. There's nothing about us that said we are human. Nothing about that at all. But the phylum Chordata, which is what we're part of, came out of the water as an amphibian, to reptilian stuff, to
how long did we come out of the water?
4.5 million years. About that.
4.5 years. Okay.
I'm sorry, 4.5 billion years. 450 million years.
450 million years. Yeah, that's what I thought.
About that.
Okay.
There is a fossil record. My colleague Neil Shubin, who's Prof of Anatomy in Chicago, did a lot of work on this, and he published a fantastic book called My Inner Fish. You might want to find that book, My Inner Fish, and it's a well worth looking at book. And he looked at stuff coming out of the water about 4.5 billion years ago.
Okay. And we've gone from there, and then onto land, but then land dwelling, but then up onto trees.
Yeah, primates. You've got to put it in the geological context of the day. You've got to look at how the African continent is breaking away from the Asian continent, and look at the Red Sea spread. About 30 million years ago, for round numbers, about 30 million years ago, there was an eruption in Arabia, should we loosely call it that, and there's an eruption going. Now, if you look at how things happen, you then get what's known as a triple junction. I need 3 fingers here. A triple junction, and you get spread from that triple junction. And simple geometry tells you that one of those arms of spread has to fail very quickly. It's called the failed arm. And now, if you look at the Red Sea and the whatever that's called in geography, the bit next to it, the Red Sea, and then the failed arm is the East African Rift Valley. And the East African Rift Valley is the center of hominid evolution. Now, what that did do, that failed arm of the Red Sea, is
we're all from Africa.
Yeah, but that changed enormously the climate, and suddenly we went from being a bit Adam and Eve, of being nice and humid and warm, and you sat in trees and you pulled off an apple, to being hot and dry and arid, and the whole change. So the selective pressures for evolution were enormous, and hominids shot up all over East Africa and South Africa at that time.
Yeah. And then went from there. And then when did the sort of this, because that's where all the fossils that you would have worked with were all Sub-Saharan based.
Yeah.
It wasn't, because when I read once, I think for one of the previous talks that I looked at, is that was the oldest shoe. It was when we were talking with Cameron. I think the oldest example of a shoe is you work with Cameron in Curtin.
I did, yes, and in New Zealand too. Yeah.
He followed you around, or did you follow him?
He followed me. Be careful with our words here, but the truth of the matter is, we were both looking for. Well, we're both renegades, and when you're a renegade in the world of podiatry, you don't sit well with people. The institution doesn't like you much, so we both had to emigrate to get a decent job, and we were both applying for the same jobs, and sadly, I got it and he didn't at Curtin. So he went to New Zealand. I became his external examiner. And so we were mates. But I knew him in the UK before that. I've known Cameron since about the middle 80s. I've known him for years. He's a good friend of mine.
Yeah, no, it was the first shoe, I think, is only about 10,500 years ago. And it's over in some museum in near Seattle. But that pales into insignificance with the fossil records. Because you said the oldest bones you have is what, 4.5 million years?
Look, the oldest fossil I've worked on is 3.5 million years. That was Littlefoot in Sturkfontein in South Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the spread started out from there. But why then the change? Why the humanoid and then the chimp and the gorilla? I mean, that sort of sees the primate track and the humanoid track. How come there wasn't a couple more? Well, there was probably.
Well, there may well have been. The fossil record's incredibly sparse. I mean, what we see is a shadow of what we got. Let's just let the dog out. Won't be saying.
Yeah. If anybody's got any questions you'd like to send in. What is late Friday night?
But don't forget, we did not evolve from chimpanzees and gorillas. What I can tell you is that we evolved from the same stock. Chimpanzees, gorillas, we had the same ancestors way back, and I'm talking a long way back. We might as well get over this now, that the E word, even today, this comes up. I can't believe it, but the E word, evolution, is a fact. It is not debatable, it is a fact. What are theories are the various mechanisms used to describe evolutionary change. But evolution as a concept, as a process, is it. It's not debatable, it is it. We don't debate evolution in this house. It is a fact.
Yes. Well, it depends whether you're talking to fundamentalist Christian Americans, and they just added it. It only goes back about 13,500 years, apparently.
But
then you ask me about dinosaurs.
Let's not go over that. We did not overlap. We missed by a lot. We had social separation. Dinosaurs and ourselves for about 65 million years.
So why the research then to compare the primate foot then as well as the humanoid? Why not just look at the humanoid foot?
Well, I'm interested in patterns of morphology because my underlying principle for the last million years has been biology, form, and function. And actually, you can improve on that and say biology, form, function, and phylogeny, because if you've got a morphology, then you've got a function, or rather a spectrum of functions that you can do with that. But that morphology has a phylogenetic basis. And if you look at patterns of morphology, a lot of them are related specifically to function. That is, we have this shape, so we have what we can do with it. But then hidden in the background behind that, much more subtle, is a set of patterns of morphological variation which don't seem to be related to function. And they seem to have a basis in phylogeny. Now, you can, given the appropriate mathematics and the appropriate processes, you can actually demonstrate morphology that is related to genetics. And that's where I'm back to the Talus again, because the Talus does this best. They all do it, but the Talus does it best. You can actually see, given the appropriate mathematical analysis, you can actually demonstrate humans to be an African ape.
Because different sections of the foot, of the tarsals and midfoot, they developed or changed at a different rate in different
That's called mosaicism, mosaic evolution, and you can demonstrate. And it's not just the foot. Anywhere you go in the body, you'll find that different parts of it evolve at different rates, and you'll find it everywhere you go. So it's just, that's no big deal. That's part of what we are. And one of the basic processes you can see in foot evolution, but I suspect it's true everywhere else, but I don't know that because I've never been there. But you'll find that you see a reduction. You see less of things. So as you go on, you start off with a lot of bones, you get less bones as you go along. So if you go back to the primitive reptilian or amphibian tarsus, you'll find more bones than we've got now, and you find they've come down to a lesser number. So if you go far,
that may lead us into one of the questions that we had, and that was from Tom Novella in the States. Tom's a dance medicine podiatrist based in New York, and Tom wanted to know about changes. Where are we? Where's Tom gone? It was the changes in. He sees that during my career, I've seen an increase in the number of patients whose res show only 2 fifth-toe phalanges. Is that an evolution on a rapid scale, or is that just an anatomical variant?
Well, let's start off by just looking at the size of the rays. One of the things that's changed, any moron knows this, is that the toes are way smaller in humans than they are in any of the other primates.
Yeah.
And so by the time you got a little toe, it's a very small structure indeed. And many of the time in the anatomy lab, we find that the middle and distal phalanges simply have not got a joint between them. They've just, I don't think they've actually joined together so much as the joints just disappeared. There is no joint there in them. And if you come back in another 500,000 years, then you'll find that the little toe only has 2 joints in for all of us. Yeah.
And
I
then,
think that's very
the second part of the question was, does he see morphological differences in the feet of various people, as in the Celts and the Mediterraneans? And of course, you talked about doing measurements in China as well. So I'm sure you must have seen quite a variation.
There is, and you'll often hear people like Cameron, for instance, will talk about the Roman foot and the Egyptian foot, and they're looking at toe length and this sort of thing. I don't have an opinion, quite frankly, about that. There might or might not be something in that, but certainly there is subtle morphological variation between different human subgroups, geographical human subgroups. You'll certainly find that, Whether they're based on function, I honestly don't know. But the differences are very, very subtle, but they are there. They are there.
Yes, and I mean, you talked about just earlier on that Talus, the squatting section.
Yeah.
I mean, that hasn't got anything to do with the sort of function then in Asian predilection for squatting.
Well, yes, it does. It's a fascinating thing. Now, forgive me here because I'm an anti-snob, whatever the hell an anti-snob is. But when you look at squatting facets, they occur basically in those people that don't use a chair. They squat on the side of the road waiting for a bus. They squat to use a toilet, whatever the hell it might be. And really, you're looking at Asia into northern India into South Africa. Now, you look at squatting facets, and the British Raj will say, I say, those people over there, those lesser qualifications, those lesser people, they work in a funny way where they squat. They're wrong. They're fundamentally wrong. This is the key issue. Squatting facets occur in every, and I mean every, human fetus. I don't care what colour your skin is, it occurs in every human fetus. So the issue is that it's not that you take a proper British Talus and abuse it. It gets funny morphology. No, other way around. We all have squatting facets the day we're born. All of us. You, me, all of us.
Right.
And then if you don't use them, you lose them. So the derived state is not squatting, if you see what I mean. And I published about it about 9 years ago. In a book that was published here in Australia. I've got a copy. I'll send you a copy. So the derived state is not squatting. The basic state is to squat. So it's a case of negative function. No, the derived state is not squatting. It's the fascinating thing.
And so they're there from the get-go, but when we don't use them, utilize them,
we lose them. You've seized up, mate.
Sorry, we were just offline there for a second.
You seized up for a minute. Yeah. So the point is, if you don't use them, you lose them. So the derived state is not to squat. Yeah. And then that begs the question: well, why do we have them as fetuses? And there's two possibilities. One is they're phylogenetic, because all apes have squatting facets. The other is, as we mentioned, I think offline before we started, that as you grow in uteri and you become a space-occupying lesion, your foot touches the uterine wall and you're forced to hyperextend. Does that make squatting facets? I don't know. We were going to go down that road and find out. And we inherited quite illegally a load of fetuses in London that had been taken out of dead prostitutes and post-mortem. But then it never worked. We sort of never got to do it. And that happens in research a lot, somehow it just doesn't happen. And that was all about 1993 or 4 or 5. Okay.
And then, it's amazing how they just so quickly disappear. But then are there other bony changes then that we create because we're not using those facets, or?
Well, yes, I suppose, because you don't just have squatting facets in the talus. They hyperextend so much. The head of the talus actually touches the anterior border of the tibia. And so you get a squatting facet on the anterior border of the tibia. So that will disappear. And there are all sorts of industrial morphologies, like people that work on spinning wheels, and they do this with their foot all day on a spinning wheel. They have funny morphological changes because of that. You'll find those in the British Museum in a group called the Spitalfields Weavers, the religious persecutors and the Huguenots that came over, Louisa Courtauld and all that lot. You'll find those in the British Museum, and you'll find
with repetitive strain and stress lines. Just
repetitive functions give you abnormal morphology. Industrial industrial disease, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that maybe brings us on to the question from Joe Kelly, a colleague of mine in Dublin in Ireland, and his question was just about that type of thing. Where do we find it? Well, again, he wanted to know, as bones led down along lines of stress, what does he think of Daniel Lieberman's research on barefoot running, and has it had any influence on hind foot evolution? I would have thought no, because we've been barefoot running for millennia, from those few million years ago, and also that we didn't start barefoot running when Daniel made his book. Although that did ruffle a few podiatry feathers, it did get people talking a little bit and thinking a little bit more, didn't it?
It certainly did. I've known Dan for years, and he won't actually remember me, be quite clear, but we've overlapped at conference, usually in South Africa, and we've had a few beers together a long time ago. But I don't really have an opinion about the barefoot running bit, because as you say, we've run barefoot for years, but I suspect we've probably covered our feet up with something like a piece of leather that's lying around, because it hurts to run barefoot, so we will do something about it. We will.
Big thorns. Yeah. Lumps of flint around.
In terms of morphology, I think wearing a shoe habitually is bound to have changed the way the foot works. But whether it's measurable, because it's going to be incredibly subtle, whether it's measurable, I honestly don't know.
Because that was the thing. I think it was Ray Anthony, one of our my early biomechanics lectures, said, when man invented the wheel, and he needed a hard, flat surface to run on, that's where all foot problems came from.
If you say so. I've had a few run-ins with Ray.
Okay, well, the foot is articulated and there's a mobile adapter, because as we talked about before, here's the deer, boys, let's go. Pack your bags. We're off to catch him. We're going to wear him down over 3 days, and we're going to be walking over undulating land. And I mean, that's why we don't have roller skates, isn't it, Bob? So far.
But you're taking a very simplistic view there, in so much as walking bipedal locomotion is certainly part of what we are, but there's much more than that, because one of the facets about standing upright is that the ground is a lot hotter, 5 degrees or therefore hotter, thereabouts hotter. So if you stand upright, then your brain is in cooler air, because one of the big problems with what stage then did we stop swinging in trees and come down and start? We're quadrupedal. Well, when do we get up on 2 feet? Probably about 1.8 million years ago, somewhere around there, in my opinion. My opinion isn't held habitually. A lot of people don't agree with me, but I think actually the bipedal habit is much more recent than we like to admit. Some would argue it's about 3.5 million years ago. I don't think so. I think it's much more recent than that. But the bipedal habit.
Would it not have been about food to start with, reaching up and getting the tastier bits in the higher branches, or was it getting the head out of the cooler atmosphere?
The Red Sea spread, because the East African Valley changed the climate of Africa enormously. And instead of being like in Adam and Eve, where you just pulled an apple off like this, all of a sudden it got hot and dry, and you had to get out of the trees to go and find a living. But you won't have got down and walked away. You'll have got to come down, gone around a bit, gone back up again, and it'll have taken place slowly. There's two issues that have to be taken into account in the bipedal habit. One is the evolution of the foot, and the other is the evolution of the head, because we got the big brain and the bipedal foot. Now, there is no doubt any longer, no doubt at all, that which came first is the foot, that we ran around on the ground with a small brain for quite a long time. And then the big brain bit came, and then that needed cooling down. The big brain used a lot of energy. It gets very hot. And so if you got off the ground, then it's about 5 degrees cooler up here than it is down there.
Yeah, because I think that's of course, you don't talk clinically, but I think that's the whole thing about the marathon running and the sub-2 hour marathon. It's the management of the heat expiration. It's cooling the body quickly enough, so they could push it more, but he'd probably kill himself, pass out with the heat extended.
We have the wherewithal to stay cool. I mean, sweating, if you like, it keeps us cool. A lot of animals don't have that. Now, if you could look at
not going to have that problem in Ireland here this summer by the looks of it. But
in terms of running after things to catch them to eat, as in sort of a hunter-gatherer, then you had to play canny, because you could run after an animal and they got overheated, if you like. They got heat exhaustion, and you could stop and go and you could sweat away and you could cool down. They can't. And so then they try to take off again, and you've recovered and they haven't. And so you wore them down very quickly. Humans are, it's not just standing up and running away. There's a lot of other bits to their evolutionary process as well. A lot of others. Evolution.
And then when did we start to spread? When did we start to spread out from Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I'm not an expert on this at all, but much later, and it won't have been in one move. There'll have been lots of different spreads out from there, and there's a lot of arguments about, did we come out as Homo sapiens, did we come out as Homo erectus? And the short answer is I don't know. I don't have a valid opinion on that, but it would have been several waves of exploration. It won't have just been one wave. There'd been a lot happening there.
Just put the light on. It's just got very dark very suddenly. But it's 10:30 at night. It's quite bright outside.
10. I've been asleep for 2 hours now.
Well, that was the other question from Joe. And again, it's more a clinical based one, but so we probably mightn't be able to answer it. But if we evolved from the ape species and eventually stood upright to spot imminent danger and see food, etc., why have we not a hind foot like a horse, or is this the direction that the feet are heading?
Well, you didn't have a hind foot like a horse to start with. You can only start off with the building blocks that you've got. I mean, if you look at an ape foot and a human foot, they're really incredibly similar. There's nothing horse-like about them, is there? I mean, that's a whole specialization of its own to become. I don't know the proper word, but you've got essentially you stand on a toenail. You've got one digit. The horse is just one digit. As an ungulate, you've got one digit there. The rest have all disappeared or nearly disappeared, and so that's a whole specialization of its own. They've gone down one pathway. We've gone down another pathway. We have a different. Yeah.
And any perspective theory? Well, there you go. That's it. We didn't start off with a horse, and I think this is a clinical question. What do you think of shock absorption infols and footwear? But yeah, you don't do clinical. Well,
I think shock absorption is very important, but you can overdo it. My mates that are into clinical tell me you can have too much shock absorption, but I don't have a clinical opinion really. I'm not registered. No,
it always struck me as strange. You get the foot going to hit the ground, and then all of a sudden it's it's sort of sinking more and more. There's the whole feedback systems wondering what the hell's going on because there's no.
That's right. No. When I was head of podiatry in Sydney, I finished that in 1999. One of my staff was Hilton Menz, and Hilton did a whole PhD in footwear and falls in the elderly, and I think that one of his findings was that you can have too much shock absorption because you lose your proprioception.
Yeah.
Now I might be wrong here because I don't have a clinical opinion, but I've got a hell of a high regard for Hilton Menz. He's a good lad.
Yeah,
very
fantastic.
Good. Yeah. I think that was one of his findings.
Yeah, I heard stories where they tried to make a Nike Air ice hockey boot, and they give it to one of the professional teams, and the guys just couldn't skate it because they couldn't feel the ice.
Yeah, we couldn't feel what was going on.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. So you were saying, so we're going to start regressing then? We're going to start losing the toes, more toes? Going to be no toes soon?
No question are going to start. We have done it. We know our toes are much smaller than they were. I mean, if you look at the overall size of an ape foot and a human foot, I'm talking about a chimpanzee or a gorilla, they're much the same as ours, But what's different is the proportions. If you look at how much the tarsus takes up, how much the metatarsus takes up, and the rays take up. Now, it's way different than us. And the truth is that the tarsus and the rays, including the metatarsus and the toes, is for round numbers half and half in humans. But then the tarsus is only about 25%. No, they've got much.
They're gripping a lot more.
They do this. They've got all that sort of thing. The fine tactile discrimination that we do with our hands. They do with their feet as well. So we've lost that. But it's not a question of going to start losing it. It is done. We've lost it. It is gone.
Losing more, or they're just going to get shorter? Because I mean, if you show us the fossil bones you have there, the feet are tiny.
Tiny.
I mean, yeah. Bone is the full skeleton there.
I don't have the rest of the skeleton.
Right, you have the small. You have the small.
Their foot is in the same proportion as the rest of their body. You know, there's no difference in foot length to the body height as such.
They were very small. They were just under a meter and a half.
Yeah. They were a little over a meter tall. You know, we're talking, you know, not talking much. They're tiny things.
Yeah, with feet too. And so when did we start? Well, of course, was it with increased nutrition then, or is it increased that we started getting bigger?
I don't know, mate. I don't know.
Let's go back to bones then. Let's go back to Talus.
There is. If you look back in the museums, you'll find that we've slowly but surely got bigger over the last 1,000 years. The oldest, apart from the fossil feet I've looked at, the oldest humans I've looked at, as in modern Homo sapiens, is about 2,000 years old. Mm-hmm. And we have been getting bigger over that length of time. It's called a secular trend, where better nutrition, etc., means we've got bigger and we reach sexual maturity earlier and this sort of thing. But in terms of the answer why we've got bigger, I don't actually know. I'm sure someone knows, just I don't know. I just not somewhere I've been.
And then the evolutionary change. So I mean, because the research, I mean, it's so painstakingly done. I mean, now you just stick it in some type of like scanner or whatever, it measures it all yourself, or do you have to go through that painstakingly measuring every facet and doing every?
This is the basic tool of the trade for all, even today. The basic tool of the trade for biological anthropologists is a pair of calipers. That's what we use. Okay. That's the basic tool, and you spend hours in museums like this, hours and hours and hours. I spent weeks and weeks and weeks in museums in the UK, South Africa, the US, measuring bones. And so you need a spreadsheet and a bone, and you measure, click into your spreadsheet. And that, okay, the tools have changed a little bit, and now people are working in 3 dimensions where they have fancy arms, a bit like a sort of magic 3-dimensional goniometer where they can measure, but it's still much the same thing. You know, the basic tool of the trade is measure.
Well, maybe getting back to how I was taught root biomechanics, surely then if I'm measuring in the same consistent way in the same plane all the time, then my measurements are going to be pertinent to me throughout my measuring career of Barefoot, if I'm doing it the same way all the time.
Well, in any measurement, the first thing you need to do is to do a reproducibility study to ensure that your measurement is biologically valid. There'll be differences here between me and the podiatric people, because I always think in biology, what's the biological significance of my measurement? What does it mean biologically? And any reproducibility study that I use has to emphasize the biology. And so what I do is a thing called a 2-way analysis of variance without replication, where I measure whatever the measurement might be. I measure it on 6 different bones 6 times. So I get a 6x6, whatever you call it, a 6x6 matrix. And then, so I look at measurement between the specimens as against within the specimens. And so the point is, I'm emphasizing the biology. I want to know how important the biology is. So I tend to get away from things like the intraclass coefficients and all that, because it doesn't emphasize the biology. I want to know what the biology means. And that's what, and any measurement you take, if you can't do that, then you discard it. You don't use it. Yeah. And so any measurement I've used has always had that test done on it to find out whether it's valid or not. And there has been a couple I've discarded over the years, but not many.
And the morphology, because I mean it's the facets of the joint, that the articulations of the joint that dictate the movement.
There is, but there's
because one of the controversial talks that we did a few weeks ago with one of my colleagues, Gary Ward, and his things were, we were all taught, or I was taught anyway, that it's muscles that move the joints. I think some podiatry colleagues, when they saw that talk, nobody's got back to me yet on that. I think they're still scratching their heads, because Gary says that joints actually move to give muscles something to do. rather than the other way around. What would you say to that, Bob?
Muscles don't have brains. No, the whole thing's coordinated by this central nervous system. But at the end of the day, joints move, and they move because muscles make them move, or gravity makes them move, because you've asked them. Your brain has asked them to do that. And don't forget, any joint will have a range of motion, and that range of motion will be dictated by essentially two facets. One is the design of the morphology, biology, form, and function. That. The second is the muscles that move it, or the soft tissue that limits it movement, i.e., ligamentous stuff, that sort of thing.
And then, of course, all the axes then that they, well, of course, they're all theoretical as well. But the axes, and of course, when I was trained again, I think I had a head scratcher about the third week out of college. Somebody had a dorsal lateral midfoot pain. And I was like, well, I knew it was a cuboid, but didn't know what was wrong with it. They told us a lot of rear foot stuff at college, and they told us a lot of forefoot. But I didn't have a clue about the midfoot, and I've since come to think midfoot's just absolutely fascinating in terms of when I moved on to treating more with manual hands-on therapy in the last 10 years of my career. Lots and lots of midfoot restrictions and lots of midfoot dysfunction.
I think the mid-tarsal joint, or whatever the hell you want to call that these days, the mid-tarsal joint is the critical issue in hominid evolution. We found that in the Olduvai fossil from 1.8 million years ago. I'll send you a paper about it. I might have already done that. I can't remember. OH8 it's called. Olduvai hominid number 8. But we found there the calcaneo-cuboid joint was decidedly human-like in that start again. If you look at a cuboid, that beak, the process calcaneus, is a uniquely human event. Chimpanzees, gorillas, etc. don't have that. It's very, very minimal. And that's important in locking the calcaneo-cuboid joint together. Don't use the word locking in terms of mid-tarsal locking. I didn't mean it like that. But it reduces enormously the range of motion in that joint. And it makes it...
It's actually corkscrew script. It sort of screws in, doesn't it?
It does screw in that. The point about it is that it stops the mid-tarsal break. Now, the mid-tarsal break, as we talk about as podiatrists, is an entirely normal event in non-human hominoids. Chimpanzees have that as a routine event in their everyday bipedal locomotion. Now, I know we have it abnormally, but we don't have it as a routine thing. Now, that's what stops it, is that beak sticking out. So we can say that the lateral side, or better put, the caudal side of the foot, has become human-like, but the medial side has not. If you look at the talar head torsion angle, it's decidedly ape-like, not human-like. So we can see that we got human from the lateral side first to the medial side second, and you can see it quite clearly, and you'll find that elsewhere. It's not just in that one foot, you'll find it elsewhere in the fossil record.
Why do you call the lateral side of the foot the interesting side?
Caudal, I called it. Cool. The thing is that the terms lateral and medial don't lend themselves properly to embryology. You have to think in craniocaudal. They're much more important. If you look in that paper I sent you on Littlefoot, STW573, you'll find a lot of description about that in there.
Yeah, I have all those papers in. Well, they're all available online. I also have it in the private Facebook, the biomechanics group. If anybody wants to join and find those, and the and yes, then so the midfoot. I always found the midfoot. And again, we were lucky enough at London Foot Hospital. We had a whole limb in our first year. Can't remember what his name was. Hadn't a clue what we were doing or what we were looking at. It wasn't until about 10, 12 years ago I went back to Galway one day and did a proper dissection day. That, God Almighty, the structures that are involved in and so deeply bound, and you know, it's absolutely if anybody hasn't done an anatomy refresher, you need to probably do one. And it's just the structures involved. It's absolutely phenomenal. But yeah, the midfoot was just, you know, there's so much going on there that we still don't know. And as you said, there's that whole locking, unlocking of the midfoot. And does it really happen? I don't know.
Well, let's keep away from this idea of mid-tarsal locking, because I'm not going there. I mean, the idea is like a lock and key. That's rubbish, you know. But you can't escape, no matter how much you denigrate root, you can't escape from the fact that if you supinate the subtalar joint, the mid-tarsal joint range of motion is little, and if you pronate the subtalar joint, the mid-tarsal range of motion is greater. You can't escape from that. That is a fact.
Yeah.
I know it's out of fashion right now, but it's a fact.
Yeah, that was the axis. That was the axis, and whether you got more knee problems or more ankle problems, and that of course Bolson Muller came at it from another direction. I mean, his paper was about the mid-70s, and again he came to lecture the
PhD thesis from somewhere in Holland, I forget where, and that was a big influence. He was one of the first that actually thought carefully about it, you know. I mean, I had that as a PhD student. I read his thesis in front of that. He thought very carefully about foot function, and I guess the root people ignored it. But they don't now. I mean, you'll find people like Kevin Kirby who refer very highly to Bolson Muller's work, you know, and it's there.
I think they had them lecturing off the same stage. I mean, they brought Bolson Muller over. He was like a god, because there's this guy who's like come out with this in the late 70s, high go low gear stuff, which podiatrists then discovered like 20 years later.
Yeah,
they were fascinated. It was really, really fascinating, and of course that tied in with our functional hallux limitus, and coming off the lateral side of the foot.
And that's all been invented since I left the profession, mate. So I don't know much about these things, but I'm quite sure they're right. But I mean, you've got to understand that you go back to the root theory. It sounded fantastic at the time, and at that time, podiatry was not an academic course. Be blunt about it; it was not an academic course, and so we grabbed it and embraced it like this. But it took some time and some balls actually to admit, excuse me, this is flawed. And I
think did Root not say that he believed it would be superseded within 20 or 30 years anyway?
He didn't mean it. He said that, yeah, but if you tried to do that, it was like, excuse me, it's like telling the Pope, you're not a Catholic. You're not allowed to do that, you know. He didn't mean it. I'm friends on Facebook with Jeff Root, his son, you know. Jeff and I talk about this quite a lot. But the truth of the matter was that he did say that. He didn't mean it. You weren't allowed to criticize, even question it. And if you do, even today with the root stalwarts like this, you know, you get a problem.
Oh, yeah, it's still been talked, because I think we talked before about, I mean, my biomechanics training that I would have been given at London Foot Hospital in the late 80s, early 90s, those are some of these notes from probably 20 years before, which were notes from 10 years before that.
And you know,
there's probably in circulation being taught somewhere now.
It shows you that nothing ever changes, because my wife's dad was a podiatrist. He qualified in Salford in 1952, I think, before I was born. And I looked at his pod notes once, but podology notes. They were the same as mine I got in 1972. So nothing changed. Nothing ever.
Just blow the dust off.
So, I mean,
blow the dust off.
I think
it's not like maths. It's not like maths where 1 and 1 is 2. Again, with work like yours and work along the way, other great researchers that have influenced it, it's changed. It's completely changed. So 1 and 1 certainly doesn't equal 2 in in anatomy and biomechanics anymore.
That's true in all biology. Actually, biology is not an exact science. And I say this to the kids that, you know, that you have to. There's always one in biology that won't get this box properly. There's always one that doesn't fit, and that's because evolution buggers things up. Excuse my language. But the truth of the matter is,
where we did talk about you have to be very particular and accurate in your research. This is it. All these double-blind research and all this sort of malarkey. There's never going to be a clinical. You can't write a clinical. There's always going to be some element where the underlying basis isn't. You can't quantify it because, as you said, it's biological.
Well, you can quantify, but there's always going to be one that doesn't fit properly. And you've got to be very careful in statistics in using them to apply to biology, in that, is it biologically meaningful or is it just statistically meaningful? I'll give you an example. If you have a drug that drops blood pressure and you measure 30 people and their blood pressure is 100, their systolic's 140, and then you give them the drug and it's now 138. Oh, fantastic, we dropped their blood pressure.
Yeah.
But it's biologically meaningful. Now, it probably isn't statistically meaningful either, but if you now increase your sample size to 2,000, it probably means it's statistically significant, but it's still not biologically meaningful. So you've got to be, at the end of the day, there's nothing replaces this. You've got to think about what it means. Just because it's statistically significant doesn't mean it's biologically significant or biologically meaningful. And that's no different in pod than it is in biological anthropology or it is in clinical studies. You know, is it biologically meaningful? It's a very important thing that I have to say some people tend to skip over, which is back to my significance test earlier on. I want something that's biologically meaningful. Otherwise, it doesn't have any basis to go forwards with me. That's the way I see it.
Okay. And then the medial column of the foot and the lateral columns, I mean, it's quite interesting. In that whole sort of like shift, and well, that was the other thing about root, it was about neutral. But I think in your research, a lot of the Talus were in a position where they were, well, is there pronation? Well, let's call it pronation. It's in a pronated position throughout the gait cycle, doesn't come anywhere near neutral, and certainly doesn't supinate.
I stay clear of gait studies. That's not something I've done much on. But the truth of the matter is, the whole concept of neutral is fundamentally flawed. Yeah, I honestly don't have an opinion really about whether we have a supinated, a pronated, and all this sort of thing that we used to study.
Okay. But and then so let's talk about then a little bit more about, well, then we're not relating it to clinical things. I keep clicking clinically about the medial lateral column. Well, where's the next progression then? If we're going to go back to then, where are we off to next with the foot?
Well, in terms of evolution, you can't say what it's going to be in a couple of million years' time. You can only say where we are now. You can, because you don't know what selective pressures are around the corner. I mean, just look at the world we're in right now. I mean, we've got a very interesting world indeed. I mean, God knows what's around the next corner in terms of, excuse the pun, about where we got, because we've got an enormous selective pressure in terms of a pandemic. I mean, I don't know what it is that some of us are going to survive and some of us aren't, but we'll have some variety of adaptation at the end of that. You know, you just can't tell what's around the next corner. When's the next meteorite going to come down and kill off the dinosaurs? You know, you just can't say. You can only say where you've come from. You can't say where you're going to. That's not something we have.
We can't plan what's going to happen, and then one of the main features then that have changed then in the from the early specimens that you've worked with through to the more recent ones.
A reduction in range of motion. If you look at a chimpanzee foot or a gorilla foot, they've got a huge range of motion, analogous to this. They've got an enormous range of motion, and you can see that reduction. And it's essentially taking place across the mid-tarsal joint. Not totally, but essentially that's the key issue, is the reduction of range of motion. And I'm not talking about pronating.
How does that happen? Is it because of the shortening in
the calcaneo-cuboid joint, the big process calcaneus, and the huge tailor head torsion angle that's taken place? Essentially, it's doubled. There's a gorilla. If you look at a gorilla, look at the tailor head torsion angle in a gorilla, compare it to a modern human. Much different.
Certainly.
The holes in the head of the tail, it used to be strung together. It's had holes drilled in to string it together. But look at an enormous difference there. No, that's a major reductionist adaptation for the medial side of the foot, the beak on the cuboid for the lateral side of the foot. That's an enormous big.
And has that just wound up the arch, has it?
Yeah. And at the same time, if you look at a calcaneus, an ape calcaneus, it essentially lay flat on the ground. They actually weight bear on the anterior aspect of it there. Humans, as you know, we have it elevated up like that. Excuse the blue track, it's been used in an exam somewhere. You elevated up like that, and it took up with it the subtalar junct axis to give us our transverse plane angle. And so that the mid-tarsal, the apex of the arch, enormous adaptation.
Because obviously all the bones and structures you were dealing with, there was no ligaments, there was no soft tissue at all. There, you weren't. Would those have changed Would those have changed anatomically over time?
They will have. I don't know enough about them to be able to comment, but no, they will have. I mean, the incredibly robust plantar aponeurosis the Homo sapiens has is incredibly important, and that's what gets up my nose when you talk about dissections of the sole of the foot. People talk about the first layer, the second layer. These are all bullshit. You know, they're rubbish. You know, these layers don't exist. They're fiction.
Yeah, we're not allowed to curse when we talk biomechanics, Bob. Apparently, only business. I'll get. Yeah.
But my issue is that you talk about these first, second, third, and fourth layers. You've missed the most important structure of all, which is the plantar aponeurosis. No one talks about that. It's incredibly important.
And what do you think about the recent trend of doing plantar fasciotomies? Just you can't fix your heel pain, just let's cut it.
I honestly don't know. I mean, I'm not being difficult. I really don't know. I have no clinical opinion, and I've been out of anything clinical for over 20 years. But
okay.
Plantar fascia is a good
idea, though. Would you like your plantar fascia?
No, I bloody well wouldn't. You're not coming near me. No, it amuses me that we talked about that. I don't think we were talking about the windlass effect and things. But I mean, what's his name? John Hicks came out of Birmingham in the UK, the Birmingham Children's Hospital, doing that work in the 50s, and it was, I wouldn't say it was ignored, but it wasn't talked about much. You know, we weren't talked about these research. I mean, that a trilogy he produced, the 3 papers in the middle 50s, were incredibly important, and it wasn't talked about much.
Just wasn't talked about. Yeah, and so then so it's that inclination angle and the arch and the self-supporting structures.
Well, yes, it's the foot's very clever indeed. It's an incredibly complicated piece of evolution. Very, very clever.
Well, Michelangelo coined it as the most fascinating or most advanced part of engineering or something. It was, but he came to it quite late. I mean, as you say, you're looking back a couple of million years at it. He was only around about 1,500 years ago. You know, so I mean, all these people trying to claim the foot along the way, and it's still got a bit to go. Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, I mean, what it does actually functionally is just phenomenal. And I mean, again, especially when you take it to the extreme, as with patients like Tom Novella and the ballet dancers or the Irish dancers that we've talked about, and just the extremes of use and abuse that it can be put through. I mean, it's always very surprising how much people can abuse their body. It actually puts up with quite a lot. That's what it's designed for.
Well, I'm always told that the elite athlete is walking down a tightrope of being really spot on to falling off, and there's very, very fine tightrope between getting the best out of their foot or their body, and then falling over and breaking it. And so, it is a fine.
And of course, I think a lot of the sequelae of foot problems come from that the talus doesn't have any muscular restrictions on it. So a very, very simple ankle sprain and an anteriorly shifted talus can have a whole knock-on consequences clinically over the years.
If you look at a chimpanzee or a gorilla foot in neutral, whatever the hell neutral is, let's not go there now, you'll find its calcaneus is very, very inverted indeed. And that, of course, is great for gripping tree trunks and this sort of thing. Now, part of the process of becoming human-like against ape-like is the calcaneus has come down in whatever the hell neutral is, let's not go there, to being much more vertical. But it's never quite vertical, you know. They're always, rear foot varus is the norm. Whatever they want to tell you, rear foot varus is routine.
Just hold on a second, Bob. Just hold us a second, because it's just coming a little bit through, a little bit clicky. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's just go on to that again. That seems to settle.
Sure. If you look at a chimpanzee or a gorilla foot in neutral, and I'm just using the word neutral like this, okay, then its calcaneus is inverted. And that's great for gripping a tree trunk or whatever the hell you're going to do with it. And part of the humanization process is bringing that calcaneus down to the ground. But forgive me for saying this, I know it's heresy. It's never quite vertical. Rear foot varus is routine. Rear foot varus is the norm. And so a subtly inverted calcaneus is routine in humans, which means, of course, when you hit the ground, when you're walking, you're on a bit of a knife edge. We all know that, because you look at the wear marks on a shoe. You all can see the lateral wear marks on a heel. And so we all know that if you've got a bit of uneven ground, you can fall the wrong way. And we've all done that. We've all fallen off our feet, as it were, as you hit the ground. I remember learning as a child. That's a few years ago now. I'm 65 now. I remember learning, if I did that, I had to learn to just drop to the ground. Otherwise, you sprained your ankle. And so we all are prone to lateral ankle sprains. That is a routine thing. And we just have to learn to live with it. It's part of what we are. No, the foot is subtly inverted in all of us.
Yeah, but I think, you know, the long-term consequences of that. And of course, everybody's all about ankle Aquinas as well. And again, it all relates around the talus.
Yeah. I promised I wouldn't say anything clinical. The truth of the matter is, I'm not sure whether ankle Aquinas is a cause or an effect. I don't know. But the truth of the matter, the majority, to me, and I'm not a clinician, be quite clear, the majority are a result of soft tissue adaptation of a gastroc or soleus group. Now, is that being caused by something? Have they taken up the slack, as it were? I don't know. Ask the whiz kids of today. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. Well, even they don't know. Even they don't know. Still working on that one. And so is there much research now being done? Because one of the when we were talking earlier on about the adaptation and the biological and then the functional behind it, because we're going to talk about the Sonic the Hedgehog gene. I didn't know there was one. India and somewhere else. Yeah. So that you know, he's quite important, Sonic. He causes brains to split in parts and gives you two eyes. And what does he do on the foot and lower limb structures?
Well, essentially, what we found in the fossil record is the adaptations we looked at from lateral to medial, better put as caudal to cranial, but same thing. We looked at anterior, posterior, or proximal distal rather, distal, and we looked at dorsal ventral. And then it didn't hit me, it hit my mentor, Professor Charles Oxnard, that this was describing the same processes that we see in genetics. That genetics describes changes in cradiocaudal, in proximo-distal, and in dorsoventral, as in Hox genes control proximo-distal, sonic hedgehogs control craniocaudal, and WNT systems, which I know essentially nothing about, and I think people know a little bit more than that, but not much either, describe dorsoventral. And so what we found was that the genetic processes we found them in the fossil record. We found the changes in the same directions as the genetic processes, which was a bit of, to me, that was like a religious event. You know, it was an enormous. I thought, good God, you know, I went to, had to go and lie down. It was incredibly important to find that. But there we are. Yeah. It was like
not only in recent years that they were able to sort of find these genes.
Well, I mean, the Hox genes have been described for years. You'll find that any genetic sonic hedgehog, certainly before my time, WNT systems are still not properly understood.
So was it Nintendo or whatever named their character after the gene? Did they?
Long after. Yeah. I've been writing about sonic hedgehogs for well over 20 years.
Okay, because I had to reread that paper twice. Never heard of this thing. It's pretty important to what the proteins that he makes. Sonic is pretty essential in human development, and so there are any other essential genes that are really important. Those other two.
That's as much as my genetics takes me, mate. I don't know any further than that. but the basis of everything is genetic at the end of the day.
And so maybe back to whatever you call it, the other guy in Dublin's question about the morphology of the about the barefoot running, and and his next question was, it was Joe in Kelly in Dublin, and it was shock absorption. Yeah, but has barefoot running had any influence on morphology? The answer is probably no, because we're doing.
I would think not. No. I mean,
anything else? High heels, those F me pumps that Cameron and I all talked about. What are they doing on?
I worked with Cameron for several years, and I know he's into all the sexuality and footwear stuff, but I stay away from that. As a matter of interest, what
has footwear done to the foot?
It may well have changed things. I mean, the habitual wearing of high heels may well cause tendocalcaneal shortening and this sort of thing. But in terms of bony morphology, yes, it may well have changed bony morphology, but it'll be incredibly subtle. And then how the hell do you know? Because you can only measure it in museums. You've no knowledge about what they're wearing on their feet. In so much as habitual function of industrial types, spinning wheel moving like this, will cause bony morphology changes, then so will footwear. But it'll be very subtle. It won't be obvious. You won't be able to say, "Oh, look at that person, they wore high heels." You won't be able to do that.
It's like Taylor beaking with footballers' ankle and stuff.
Yeah.
And things like that. The repetitive nature of it. Yeah. So the bones are obviously adaptive, isn't it? All those osteoblasts working away hard to try and keep the strength.
There will be some adaptation. I mean, the osteoclast balance, it will take place. I'm quite sure. Yeah.
So it's continually changing all the time, and then obviously there's the sequelae then you weren't looking at it clinically of broken bones and stress fractures and stress reactions. They're pretty huge.
Yeah, I've picked up abnormalities in collection, not the fossil record. Well, this one doesn't know, but when I've been measuring in the museums, I've picked out specimens. Oh, there's something wrong with that one. I won't look at that one. I remember one Victorian British woman from the Spitalfields collection in the Natural History Museum I looked at years ago. I got 2 tibia, and one had Paget's disease. You will find these in the boxes. You will find abnormalities, but you don't measure them. You put those away and go to another one instead.
There've been other changes with that. Well, of course, Cameron and I talked a lot about syphilis and those sexually transmitted diseases all through the Middle Ages. They would have had quite an effect on bone structures.
They did. I personally have not measured anything syphilitic, so to speak, at least not I know. But so I know that there are a lot of bony changes. I remember reading not long back about Henry VIII's body was exhumed a while back to find out, and he didn't have syphilis. They thought he did have, but he didn't have. That's sort of and Edward Longthings was taken out of his grave a while back to have a look at it, and he didn't have any either. It's one of those.
There was quite a few popes died of it.
I wouldn't surprise me. Welcome to the world of hypocrisy, mate. Yeah, yeah. I'm not going there. Right out of that.
and so then, because obviously the research then, as you say, then developed over the years. I mean, you ran anatomy. I mean, you ran anatomy labs. That's what you did, and I mean, obviously you were head of departments for the anatomy section in the university. So, what other research from yours did that spin out of the labs then?
There's lots of stuff. In terms of feet, the biggest one that I can think of quickly is in 1992. I was a PhD student and I was passing through Johannesburg to work at the Dart collection at the University of Witwatersrand, and I did a guest lecture for the School of Pod there because their head of the school at the time was Andy Clark, and Andy Clark taught me in Manchester. So one does a guest lecture because that's what you do. And when I finished talking about the evolution of the arch or something like that, this guy at the back of the class, member of their staff, came up to me and said, "That's what I need to do." And that was Bernie Zitveld. And he's a guy you should get in contact with. Bernie Zitveld's a fantastic guy. He did a PhD with me on pre-pastoral metatarsals. Me and a guy called Lee Berger in Africa. And he's now head of fossils and rocks at the University of Witwatersrand. He's got a lot of stories. He's a good lad. He's a very good lad. He's Bernie Zitveld. And I'll send you his details. And he could do one of these for you because he's still got one foot in the pod world, unlike me, who's left it all together. And he's that's worthwhile. So he worked on metatarsals. But in my lab, outside that, we did work on the scapula, we did work on the pelvis, work on craniofacial morphology. This is various graduate students of ours, mine, other people too. There's a lot of good work came out of all that, but it all essentially was based on bone morphology, about patterns of morphological variation. What do they mean? Are they genetic?
Yeah, because I remember seeing a really good poster presentation on what was part of one of the masters that I did, and it really explained. If I got a pen, it really explained the way that metatarsals work. He put it like the metatarsal was like the pole vault, or you're pitching the pole vault into the box, and then you get all this strain on the metatarsal coming this way, and then it flicks it up, so it's planted on the ground, and then it bends this way, and then it recoils and flips you over. And I mean that was a really good way of looking at the way that the trabeculae are laid down within the bone.
They are indeed. I mean, you go back well over 100 years, you'll find that people were recognizing biology, form, and function. Look at trabeculae and comparing it to the steel girders in a crane or something. You know, they were. I mean, there was one famous bit of work where some anatomist was looking at the trabecular structure in the femur, and this engineer said, "That's my crane. My crane's got the same structure." You got them all arranged in the appropriate way. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of work done on that, a lot of work. And what's interesting is the various tools that have been used to look at this, the various techniques to look at it, have all been borrowed essentially from the geological world, been borrowed from the earth sciences. And a lot of the recent work's been done on things called fast Fourier transforms, where they use computer analysis to look at the analysis, the arrangement of these trabeculae. But for instance, in the vertebrate, in the humans, you'll find them all arranged like this and like this, because that's what we do. We stand up. Look at orangutans, you won't. They're all over the place. They're random because the orangutans don't stand up like half the time.
Yeah, well, are we going to go back to orangutans? Because we are supposed to be up off our asses, and now we're sitting on them all the time. That's going to cause a lot of problems. The morphology must be changing then if we're all sitting on our behinds.
It will change. I mean, you'll see it in soft tissue first, you'll see it in bony tissue after that. Let's not forget that bone, this is one of the pod problems. They tend to think of bone as being like a lump of granite. It doesn't change, the rock of ages. Bone does change. It just doesn't change on the same time scale as soft tissue. And when people talk about, for instance, an abnormal subtalar joint axis, my immediate comment is the cause of or caused by. Because if you have an abnormal foot function, it will move the axis. It will move.
Yeah. Well, we see that. We do see bony change and everything, of course, over years in bunions and calyx limitus and things. And yeah, that was always the one thing. How you get somebody in with like about 5 degrees of dorsiflexion, and they've only just started getting pain last week with a huge, big, thickened osteoarthritic joint. But again, that's all the adaptation and the envelope of function and things. But you do see that changing over time. And stress fractures are quite common in a lot of the dancers and a lot of the repetitive strain. And of course, there's multi-factors in that. But this has been a good period talking to, again, Tom in New York with the ballet dancers and my friend Pat Ruddy and any other pain and movement specialists who work with elite athletes. This has been a great time over lockdown to actually really, really rehab these things properly, get them fixed. Because as you said, with before, these elite athletes are always walking on the tightrope of.
That's right. Yeah.
They're always carrying an injury. So it's been fantastic. Tom's got dancers who've been dancing with sort of hip problems for the last 15 years and haven't been able to take a break. And with lockdown, they've been able to fix the problem, rehab it properly, and will probably extend their dancing career by another 10, 15 years. So it's been absolutely fantastic. It has had its advantages, this lockdown time. So the research is fascinating. And of course, you're not getting on the clinical and footwear, but well, that's always the thing. I mean, we've got this natural fat shock absorber pad, and as you say, the plantar aponeurosis. I mean, are we going to be able to make something out of a bit of chemistry kit that's going to be able to reproduce that?
I doubt it, my son. I doubt it. Yeah, no, it's the human foot is incredibly clever. I mean, the more I study it, the less I understand it. Quite frankly, Justin, it's incredibly clever, incredibly clever.
And if you were to get back into the lab now, where would your research, do you think, where would your area of interest be now, Bob?
Oh, I'd still be in bone morphology, but I'd look at it in different ways. I'd use different tools. One of my heroes back in about 1920 was working on things called thin plate spline. So we had these grids like this, and you took a piece of body and you bent it and saw where the grid changed place. And this was a guy called Darcy Thompson, and he said, because this is only in 2 dimensions, we really need to think in 3 dimensions, but it'll have to wait for other hands and other times. That was 1918 or 1919. Well, other hands and other times is there now. The tools to measure in 3 dimensions are there now, and that's where we.
MRI, is that where it's going? MRI and CT stuff?
Yeah, it'd go there. Yeah, it'd go into 3 dimensions. And imaging is a big way forward, about which I know little. It's all been invented since I was a graduate. Don't forget that the silicon chip was invented when I was about 2 years out of into practice, you know. And CT scanning was just becoming a theoretical entity in 1977. You know, I mean, I graduated in 75. No, these are all things happened since my day. I know nothing about them.
Yeah, of course you do, Bob. Look, you got it here. It's called Google. I'll tell you all about it. That's where I get all my information from. That's where I found out about Pollock and his buddies.
You know, they've been employed in anatomy labs today. They're not old codgers like me that know about bone and know about muscle. They know about imaging. Yeah. They know about imaging now. You know, they're the kids that have been employed.
Yeah. And I mean, when I'm going to talk to my orthopedic surgeon colleagues in the next week or two with Nick Cullen, and I mean, those guys are on to, well, I mean, they've all got bone banks now where they're grafting out of bone banks, but they're all growing stuff now, and it's all the new biologics that they're injecting on stem cells. I mean, that's the fascinating thing where orthopedics is going. But back to orthopedic research, you know, we don't need another orthopedic paper that says they put in 3,000 of a certain hip replacement, and aren't we getting great results? I mean, we don't need any more of that. But yeah, we're the biologics and the stem cells where orthopedics is going and growing. 3D print bone in a lab.
You're looking at a parallel evolution there, because we've talked a bit about how podiatry has changed hugely in the last 50 years. I mean, the course I was taught in 1972 to 1975 is nothing like the course we get now. But the same happened in medicine. Don't kid yourself, no different. I mean, I don't like to admit it, but McMurray, as in McMurray's osteotomy, was my grandfather's cousin. Now, my grandfather was a Belfast boy, and McMurray worked in Liverpool. But they weren't taught medicine as in thinking. They were taught medicine, you cut it like this, and you do that, and it was no different. They've changed just the same as we've changed. You know, they've come to an intellectual, academic side. No different. As you said, if you look in an orthopedics paper in 1975, you'll find 60 million different ways to do a hip replacement. But that's all gone now. That's all gone. You'll find evidence-based practice, and you'll find they're referring to Cochrane and things. You know, the world has moved. But we're living in parallel universes. You know, both professions have evolved in much the same way, from being an apprenticeship model to being a thinking model. There's no difference.
Yeah, because the surgeons, they all developed just from the field surgeon, with the red and white.
That's right. The barber surgeons in the Navy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where it came from, and the field podiatrists and chiropodists and stuff. That's where it all developed from. Unfortunately, we've taken a slightly different approach to how we structure things, and you know, you're probably unaware if you're out of the loop. I was going to say earlier on, maybe when we regress with the toes, people won't have to worry about cutting toenails and what foot health professionals are doing if we're going to regress to no toes in a few years.
Here's an example of why you think about it rather than just learn it. I mean, whether you know or don't know is not the point, but did you know that if you look at fingernails and toenails, their nerve supply, if you look at the skin, well, if you can call it skin, underneath the nail, they're supplied from the ventral surface. They're supplied from the palmar or dorsal surface. That is, the nerve comes round and onto the top. So the skin on your foot, the skin under the nail bed is supplied from the medial plantar nerve and the lateral plantar nerve. Why? I always ask question, why? And you can learn it parrot fashion, or you can actually understand that the nail is, of course, a modified claw. And the claw is a ventral structure. And if you look at embryology, you'll find the claw starts off on the palmar surface or on the plantar surface, grows round. And when these structures move, they take the nerve supplies with them. But you won't have found that in anatomy textbooks of 50 years ago. You won't find it in our pod notes. No one told you that all those years ago. So they're perfectly of understanding, not just learning.
Well, it depends whether they've brushed up their pod notes recently and upgraded them, or they're still teaching stuff from 50 years ago. That's what I'm worried about.
I think you'll find it changed, and I honestly believe it started changing big time in Northampton. That was a really. I will never regret having 3 years in Northampton before I left the Northern Hemisphere. I learned to be a much better teacher, a much better teacher. No, they were good staff, and they turned the course on its head to being a thinking course. Their motto was, "We are here to produce a reflective podiatrist," and I think that was absolutely right.
Yeah, no, I hope we're going to be still turning out good podiatry students. I interviewed one from Glasgow a couple of weeks ago, and she was a phenomenal practitioner. So if some of the schools are going to be turning out anyway half as good as we were before, the future will be bright. But I think they're struggling a little bit to attract students. Is it the same thing as happening in Australia, or?
Don't know, mate. I don't know. I teach the anatomy to pod students in the University of South Australia. I start again in 2 weeks' time doing that. But in terms of attraction,
all be online, will it, Bob?
Well, I've just finished teaching the other not pods, but I've taught OTs, physios, etc. online all this last semester. We've been allowed to do some lab. Having said that, you probably, if you follow the news, you know that Victoria's gone revolting
again,
and so we may have another shutdown starting in a week's time. I don't know. But I did all online, just like we're doing now. Last semester, we're doing the lectures online, but we have been allowed into the lab this next semester, they tell us. But I suspect in the next 2 weeks that'll get cancelled. I don't know that. I'll have to find out.
Yeah, challenging times ahead.
Very.
But and of course, of course, all your wealth of research is all available online.
It is, and you can do an awful lot online. I did my first degree, not podiatry, but I did my first degree with the Open University in the UK. So I'm not scared of distance learning. I know about distance learning, but you have to have a different approach to it. Now, my standard, because I'm a bit in your face, my standard reply to these things is that doing anatomy without bodies is like doing geology without rocks. But the truth of the matter is you can do it. You just have to take a whole different view to how you do it. Nevertheless, you still can't touch it. I want people to get their fingernails dirty on a body. I want
you do definitely said, but in that anatomy dissection, when you do get your hands on, and you actually can put fingers in places and feel, the structures there, but also just how such tightly it's bound. We used to think there was moving ligaments and joints and stuff. I don't think I am anymore. I think you need a jackhammer to get some of the joints actually moving. They're that tightly. The structures are.
By the time I've been pickled for several months, but I know
there's those 3Ds. There's that 3D. Well, it used to be on this DVD. Now it's online. The Anatomy in Motion, or that series. You can buy the different parts.
These things are very good.
You can't. I mean, that's been around for like 10 or 15 years, but you can't then. You need to have it in your hand to feel it, touch it.
And there is another aspect here that's missing, Justin, that people don't think about, and that is that if you do something online, i.e. with a body or whatever it might be, you're removing all biological variation. We're not all the same. There are subtle variations in normal, and those are incredibly important to understand. Because if you take a bell curve like this, a bell curve of normal, essentially you're looking at 3 standard deviations, give or take a bit of variations on the mean. And then you start working into abnormal. Well, that is it normal, is it abnormal, is where you make your living. Where things are just not quite perfect, they're subtly abnormal. And if you sit on your ass behind a desk all day, it will never be a problem. But if you start running marathons, it is going to be a problem. That variation on normal is incredibly important. Now, doing it online or with only one body, you'll never get that. You need to have, 20 hours in front of you to see why things are different.
Yeah, well, so is that it? If we were to be walking on the non-hard flat surfaces made for wheels, and we just casually strolled after the deer, would we be getting all these overuse injuries? And we might get a few twisted ankles along the way, but if we're having a leisurely stroll after them over the peat bog in the west of Ireland, very possibly. Injuries, because there's a huge plethora of overuse. I don't know. I think we're just, again, it just gets labeled, and we just end up looking for what's there and what's commonly the latest research papers told us to look.
If you take any structure and abuse it, it'll fail prematurely. The way I tell my students, if I put my car into a Grand Prix, it's going to fail. It's not made for what it's doing. So you take any structure and take it'll fail eventually. The question is, where is that landmark whereupon it fails? Now, because when I teach, and almost invariably the people I teach with are sports runners and this sort of thing. So being me, so in your face, I say, well, I don't run. And the only time I run is if some days the pub might close before I get there, then I might run a little bit. But they look at me a bit weird then. But the truth of the matter is that most people don't stop to understand that any structure will fail if you try hard enough. It's only a question of where that landmark is between failure and non-failure, as it were.
Yeah, some catastrophic failure videos that you can see, especially when the Achilles tendons let go and like that in matches. Well, you get that a lot in the rugby matches and things. Remember, famously, Paul O'Connell. He managed to rip his insertion of origin of his hamstring off the back of his pelvis over a ruck one time. When those let go, you know all about it.
I bet you. This is how little I know about sport. I've no idea who you're talking about. I don't even know who that is. Paul O'Connell, was it? I've never heard of him.
Irish rugby legend, Lion legend, Anyway, Ireland's rugby captain, Talus man.
My only claim to fame in rugby is I once shared a seat next to him on a flight from Auckland down to Wellington, sitting next to Grant Fox, and I had no idea who he was. I had no idea at all. But we did have a beer together.
Yeah, very good. When those sort of things let go at that high level, it's not good to see. I mean, you sometimes you see that in some of the athletics as well, especially the sprinting. When things get stressed too much, they let go in a big way. But of course, then that's the whole recovery from that. And the computer aided. Well, they're going to be 3D. They're going to 3D print bones. I mean, they're going to be able to 3D print taluses and put them in. It's
very clever indeed. Yeah. And I'm not in any way knocking the technology. I just don't understand it. It's just I've reached the point in life where it's going faster than I can go. I mean, I can barely use a telephone these days.
We're all going to live for 40 or 50 years longer than we thought we were. I am.
Well, yeah, possibly. Yeah.
I'm here to 120. I thought it was
we're all living a lot longer. That's for sure. I mean, I'm 65. If you go back 100 years, well over half of my age group will be dead. You don't get to that age. And when the British first put together their old age pension, it was only assumed that about 5% of people would actually take it. The rest will be dead before they got there.
Extending it out.
Yeah. Well, I don't get my old age pension. I have to wait another year. I don't get until I'm 66.
Yeah. I think in Ireland now at 67 they've stretched it out too. Of course, in France they're all out on the streets revolting, taking heads again. We just say, oh, okay, well,
the recognition of people living longer has been known by governments since well before the war. But to start voting for or deciding to produce legislation that means you get your pension later is like turkeys voting for early Christmas. You won't get back into power again. So every government's put it on the too hard basket since time started. But it's true. We live longer. There's no way around it. We definitely live longer.
Yeah, we're doing something right, or wrong perhaps. So Bob, that was fascinating. We've done an hour and a half. I'm sure we could talk more. Unless there's
it's nearly 7:40. It's an hour and 40 minutes for me. I can't believe it.
Flies by. See, this is it. When you don't have a script, or we just end up talking about anything like Sonic and everybody. So, Bob, where can everybody else? If people want to find out more about you, where they can find out? Well, just Google Bob Kidd, Robert Kidd, Dr. Robert.
Technically, I'm dead, you see. I don't actually do anything any longer, but I just teach casually. I'm no longer a permanent member of staff at university. I retired when I was 55. Forgive this, but all my friends were dying. I thought, sod this, I better get on with it quickly while I can. So that was 10 years ago. We spent half the year traveling and half the year working since.
And as you said, Ros, your wife, great good wife, Ros, is a podiatrist as well. And her history, she was on high risk podiatry right the way through.
All she's ever done. She's never treated a private patient in her life. She has only ever worked in high risk feet, and she was the founder and director of the high risk foot clinic at Sydney Hospital, at Liverpool Hospital in Sydney. Yeah. We became a world model. Even the guys like Bolton came out to see what she was up to from Manchester. But that's what her life's always been. She won't thank me for telling you this, but she was a twin. Her twin died about 25, no more than that, 30 years ago, with all the revolting effects of type 1 diabetes, everything you could possibly imagine she had. And I wouldn't say that's why Ros is into it, but it did sharpen her interest in it, if you see what I mean. And,
so destructive, and so very destructive, very, very quickly, right throughout the body, not just with the foot. No. I mean, the damage that it does to the foot, that neuroischemic foot. It's just, again, we were looking at London Foot Hospital. I would have said London Foot Hospital was one of the leading podiatry schools at the time. We had a fantastic diabetic clinic and a Hanson's clinic as well. And London was the main referral centre. And some of the diabetic catastrophes that we used to see on a Monday morning were just, I've never seen anything like it. That so disruptive. And of course, that's the thing now in the States, is the highest rates of the death with COVID. It's all about diabetes and all about obesity. There's a higher risk levels. Which is a little bit worrying. So we should maybe get Ros on and talk about high-risk diabetic feet. Apparently she's got a great story about Tim Kilmartin that we need to tell, but that's for another time. And also, I've got to mention Forgotten Feet. Are you aware of Forgotten Feet in the UK, Bob? Well, you're going to come see it.
I know Belinda virtually. We were Facebook friends. We never met her, but we talked virtually. I know.
Forgotten Feet next 7th of May. They're cycling from Land's End to John O'Groats, 9 days, 900 miles, 100 miles a day. I'm going to sail it. We're going to go and sail it in a boat raised for charity as well. So ForgottenFeet.org, it provides great podiatry services for homeless and disadvantaged charities in the UK. So that's going to be the 7th of May next year. You can contact me or ForgottenFeet.org. For any information that you want. And Bob, you're a sailor as well. You can go sailing with us. We're going to go to the west coast of the east coast of Ireland, up the Irish Sea. We might stop in here where I am in Carlingford. I haven't done very much to the West Highlands, so I might stop off there for a day or two. Give the cyclists a chance to catch up. We get a fair wind. My only worry is we're not going to get enough wind. And the cyclists don't have to worry about
that. Your prevailing winds from the southwest, you should be all right.
And of course, then we figured out the other day, we've got to sail the boat back. We're not just going to stick it in the back. So that'll be fantastic next year. So Bob, that was great. Thank you very much. Sure, people have more questions, and we will talk soon. Anybody wants Bob's details, they can get in touch with me, and I can put you in touch with Bob. We'll talk soon. So you stay put, Bob. We're going to finish this broadcast now.